Here we are. It's Thursday, June 29th. I'm Larissa, and we're here at One of Gallery Studio, and I am reading my newest novel, When It Becomes Too Much, and I just picked up the printed version of my second draft, so I have my red pen. I might make some notes while I'm reading. When It Becomes Too Much, When It Becomes Too Much, by Larissa, an original work of fiction. Chapter 7, A Lot of Room. Patty was more than a little concerned. Brian had flipped so easily on his feelings about Sydney. She was worried he would make a rash and premature choice. Then again, Ruth would be there. Ruth most certainly had the more level head of the two, and she frequently stopped Brian from doing dumb things. Like that time she talked him out of that gold grill for his top front teeth. It would have been an absurd expense for something Brian would have lost interest in quickly. His fascination with hip-hop lasted all of about 6 months. It ended when Brian took Ruth to a Drake concert, and he ran into someone he knew. It ended when Brian took Ruth to a Drake concert and ran into someone who knew the man who gave Brian HIV. The guy actually tried to pick a fight with Brian. Brian, Ruth, the guy, and his partner were all eventually asked to leave the concert. Brian had been angry because he really hadn't done anything. The experience was enough that he quit listening to hip-hop at all. Patty was relieved. She hated hip-hop. She listened to new age music like Enya and Yanni. Patty was sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee when Brian finally emerged from his bedroom. "So, what time are you meeting with Sydney?" she asked just as he entered the room. He was trying to be quiet enough for her not to hear him. But it really was true what they said. When you lost one sense, the others got stronger. Not only could Patty hear Brian tiptoeing, she could smell the shampoo and conditioner on his wet ponytail. Brian pouted, disappointed at not being able to slip past his mother undetected. "2," she said, "be there around 2. Ruth and I are going to Steamers first. I'd bring you a salad, but we aren't coming home after. We're going straight out to Sydney." "Oh, okay. You could still bring me something home on your way back." "No, I can't, because I will drop Ruth off and then not go anywhere near Steamers to come home. It's not on the way. If you want me to bring something home, it will be dinner time by then. I can bring home pizza from Nick's. I pass right by there between Ruth's and here, and you love his salad and slice combo." "Just a cheese slice this time," Patty said, taking a drink of her coffee. "There's more coffee in the pot," she said, nodding behind her to the kitchen. If her eyes weren't so obviously glassy, it would be hard to tell she was blind most of the time, at least when they were in the apartment. She knew every inch of the place. If they moved, it was going to take some time for her to get resituated. She knew the house, but hadn't been there in years, and the ADA apartment was remodeled since the last time she had visited. Melvin had always been a pretty good handyman. Brian hoped the house was still in good shape. He didn't want to have to do too much at first. "Cheese it shall be. If you just want cheese, I'll get a whole pizza and we can share. I'll get a large salad too, so we can share that also." "I guess that'll be okay. But if you're going to Steamers again, don't you be eating that grease bomb or whatever it's called. You just had it yesterday, and you might not be fat like your dad yet, but just give it time. He didn't get big until he turned 50. You're not there yet, but time will go by fast. 42 isn't so far from 50, you know." "Don't worry, I'm getting lunch today anyway." In all honesty, he didn't think he could eat another big greasy after yesterday. He lay on his bed for a long time the previous afternoon and evening, willing the day's meal to digest. It was going to shock Ruth and Hannah when he ordered a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. Brian ordering a bowl of soup and half a sandwich was even more shocking than Ruth's golden toenails. He always said soup was for the old and invalid, and half a sandwich would ordinarily be no more than an appetizer for Brian. Yes, Ruth was going to be shocked. Brian poured himself half a cup of coffee in a to-go mug and filled it the rest of the way with cream. His mom made the coffee twice as strong as it should be. "Okay, I'll see you later with pizza," Brian said, kissing his mom on the cheek and walking out the door. "Okay," Patty called after him. Ruth looked at the clock. It was almost 10. Brian would be there soon, but she didn't care. She was going to smoke one more cigarette. She opened the pack. She only had one more left anyway. Might as well finish them off. Her hair dyeing adventure from the day before had worked out well. Brian was going to like it. Ruth knew she liked it. Brian better like it. Oh, who cared what Brian thought? It's not like she needed his approval. Ruth stamped out the butt of her cigarette and left it in the ashtray on the table on her back patio and went inside. She took a quick shower to wash the smoke smell off her skin and out of her hair. She still had conditioner left over from the day before. She used it instead of shampoo. After getting out of the shower, she towel-dried her hair and then stood nude in her closet looking at her choices. Normally, Ruth wore jeans and some plain blouse or t-shirt and loafers or sandals to work. She was feeling different now, however. Her work uniform seemed inappropriate somehow. She reached in the back behind her collection of jeans and pulled out a batik-dyed shift dress she had bought on the boardwalk last time she and Brian went to Santa Cruz. It was magenta, orange, and teal, with black outlines around the repeating bird shapes. It was cheerful. She combed out her hair and scrunched it in her fingers, deciding to let it air dry. Until it dried, you didn't really see the impact of the dye job. Ruth knew it would take a little while for her hair to dry, and the color change would be a fun surprise to spring on Brian while they were out. She fastened a pair of gold hoops in her ears and put on a pair of open-toe flats. Hanging on the back of her chair was a long, lightweight, black, open-weave cardigan. She put it on over the dress and grabbed her giant bag. As she turned to go down the stairs, she heard knocking at the door. "On my way down, Brian," she yelled. "Okay, I'm parked right here in front. Are you ready?" he yelled back through the door. "Yes," Ruth said, opening the door, smiling. Brian smiled back. "Great, let's go," he said, and they both turned towards the car. As they buckled in, Brian looked at Ruth carefully. "Something's different. Don't tell me. I'll figure it out," he said. Ruth just laughed, then coughed a little. "Stop the cancer sticks," Brian said as they pulled out into traffic. Ruth rolled her window down and let the air flow through her still wet hair. The smell of the special conditioner was sweet and fruity, different than the lavender-scented soaps she normally used. "Did you get a new shampoo or soap or something?" Brian asked. "Not really." Ruth wasn't lying. She just used the packet from the hair dye kit. She didn't get new soaps. The small deception gave Ruth a childlike pleasure. Brian pulled in Steamer's parking lot and parked in a regular spot in the back. It was already 11:10. No breakfast. "You're going to have to eat lunch today, Brian. What are you going to do?" "Eat lunch? That's what. Who cares?" "I'm just surprised is all. You didn't even mention breakfast." "Well, maybe I'm not in the mood for breakfast." "Whatever. Relax." "Is that the dress you bought at the boardwalk?" "Why, yes, it is. You have a good memory," Ruth said, holding the door to the diner open for her friend. Hannah was at the register. "Hey, you two. Long time no see. Sit wherever you want," Hannah said, grabbing a couple menus from a pocket behind the register. "With you, it's not hard to remember. You never wear dresses. Now you've worn one 2 days in a row. I can remember almost every time I've ever seen you buy or wear a dress. The day you bought that dress, we had fried Twinkies and rode the pirate ship thing." Brian was right. Ruth hardly ever wore a dress, let alone 2 days in a row, and they did have deep-fried Twinkies at the boardwalk that day. Hannah followed Ruth and Brian, listening as they made their way to a corner booth. She sat the menus down on the table. "Whatever he's saying to you, you and your dress look nice, Ruth." "Do either of you want some coffee?" Hannah asked. "No coffee for me," Ruth exclaimed. "I already drank enough coffee for all of us. I'll have a cranberry juice." "And I'll have a root beer," Brian said. Both Hannah and Ruth looked at him funny. "A root beer? Okay, if you say so," Hannah said, turning to get the odd order. Ruth leaned across the booth towards Brian. "A root beer? Since when do you drink root beer?" "Since when do I not drink root beer? I happen to like it." "My mom just keeps the house stocked with that Crystal Light shit." Brian opened his menu, then remembered he knew what he wanted and folded the menu and his hands triumphantly in front of him while Ruth looked at the options on the special sheet. I don't know what I want," Ruth said, running her right index finger down the changeable sheet of paper stuck in the clip in the interior back page of the laminated menu. "Maybe a chicken sandwich. You want my fries?" she asked Brian, meeting his gaze. Her hair was finally pretty much dry, and it was a hazy, wavy mass around her face. The sun was shining in the window, and now you could plainly see Ruth's hair. The white hairs looked like strawberry blonde highlights, and the rest of her normally mousy brown hair was just slightly rosier and shining. Brian gasped. "Your hair! You dyed it!" Brian blurted. "Yep. Do you like it?" Ruth smiled even bigger. "It looks great. You look great." Brian was looking at Ruth in a very different way now. Normally she was plain and nondescript, but now he was feeling a little guilty about taking up her time. The woman sitting across from him should be on a date with someone who wanted to hold her hand, kiss her, and brush the hair from her face. She was actually radiant. Well, thanks. That's a big compliment coming from you. You gonna eat my fries? They come with it. I might. We'll see. If you're not gonna eat them, tell me. I'll get fruit instead. Get the fruit. Okay. Hannah was walking back over to the booth with the drinks. She sat them on the table and took her tablet and pen out. So, what are we having today? She asked, smiling. I'll have the grilled chicken sandwich with a fruit cup, no mayo. And for you, Brian? I'll just have a bowl of the vegetable soup and half an egg sandwich, please. Brian took a sip of his root beer and looked at the two women. Hannah furrowed her brow and Ruth's mouth hung open. A bowl of vegetable soup and half an egg salad sandwich? Hannah asked slowly to clarify she heard correctly. But you always say soup is for the old and invalid, Ruth chimed in. Folks grow up sometimes, Ruth. Brian turned toward Hannah. Yes, soup and half a sandwich. That's what I want, Brian said, putting an end to the conversation. Ruth just shook her head in disbelief. Okay. Shocking, but okay, Hannah said as she walked towards the call window. Over lunch, Ruth and Brian excitedly discussed the pros and cons of moving in with Sydney. Both friends had made a list. They really were so much alike in so many ways. I'm a little worried about sharing a kitchen. I'm not doing your dishes. Not to worry, this house is really neat. My grandfather designed it and had it built. Each floor is kind of like its own apartment. There's a kitchen, dining room, and living room in the middle of each floor, with a bedroom suite on either side, and it's 4 floors, plus the master apartment off the back of the main floor kitchen, and the master apartment has its own small kitchen too. My grandfather always hoped my father and some of his siblings would live there after they married. There used to be a barn. It was torn down when I was real little. They used to have animals. It was like a little farm with animals, gardens, and everything. Oh, I had no idea, Ruth said. This was sounding better and better. Yeah, after all the kids but Uncle Melvin moved away, they ran it like a bed and breakfast. Grandma didn't cook, but the kitchens were stocked for guests to make simple breakfast. Melvin lived in the bottom floor with Sydney and eventually Peter and my Aunt Selena. They had the inn for years. Melvin still ran the inn until my Aunt Selena died. That wasn't too long after my dad died. It was the summer after senior year of high school. I remember because Sydney was supposed to go to college out east, but ended up staying back here and going to San Jose State instead. Tell me more about Sydney, and who's Peter? Peter is Sydney's stepbrother. My Aunt Selena was a widow like my Uncle Melvin. Sydney's mom was hit by a drunk driver when Sydney was 4. Peter's dad died in Korea. Aunt Selena met Uncle Melvin when she started working as a maid at the inn. Peter only lived at the inn for a couple months. He was a lot older than Sydney and I. He already had a job and moved into his own place to be close to his job. Now he lives in Denver with his family. Sydney was always kind of a Barbie princess type. Brian took a break from talking to eat some soup while Ruth was organizing all the new information in her mind and pushing the watermelon and pineapple on her plate to the side away from the second half of her sandwich. Oh, so he doesn't really have claim or ties to the house then? Ruth picked up her sandwich and took a big bite. Oh no, not at all. He's super close to his dad's family and never even came around for our family holidays or anything. I heard my mom say his dad left him a bunch of money when he died. He never took anything from my Uncle Melvin and Aunt Selena. Sydney, well, like I said, she was always kind of a princess. I think because she grew up at the inn and her dad worked there and with my grandparents. It was like their castle. She was the princess. It got on my nerves. Why? Were you jealous you weren't the princess? Ruth asked with a smirk. And so what if I was? It's a really cool house, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little jealous of her being able to go swimming or play tennis whenever she wanted, or when she got the pony. We always lived in some big, boring apartment. One time, one had a pool, but it wasn't big, and all the little kids peed in it. Now Ruth felt kind of bad. Anyone would have been jealous in Brian's situation. Anyone would have felt that way, Brian, she consoled. Exactly. And she always rubbed it in everyone's face. Ruth was trying to hide just how excited she was to see this place. She was trying to be cool as a cucumber. There was a lot riding on this visit. She was nervous about meeting Sydney, but at the same time, all that room shouldn't go to waste, especially when there were folks like Brian, Patty, and Ruth with real need. Chapter 8, A Lot of Possibility. It was almost 1:30 when Brian and Ruth finally piled into the hooker buggy in Steamer's parking lot. Sydney said 2-ish or around 2 or something like that, so they had some wiggle room. Brian had no idea what traffic was going to be like between South San Jose and the house. On a light day, it would normally take an hour. That put them at the house no earlier than 2:30. Brian stuck the key in the ignition and pulled out his phone and plugged the address in the GPS. It said with traffic they would get there by 2:38. I'm going to call Sydney real quick and let her know we're on our way. Okay, Ruth said, buckling her seatbelt and checking her teeth in the side rearview mirror. I got her voicemail, Brian said quietly. Hi, Sydney, it's Brian. We're on our way. GPS says we'll be there around 2:30. See you then. Brian tucked the phone in the tray under the dash, and they were on their way. When they pulled in the horseshoe driveway, Ruth gasped. The house was the cutest thing she had ever seen. The grounds needed some work, and there were obviously a few rungs missing from the front porch railing. But from the outside, things looked pretty promising. Sydney was sitting on a wicker bench on the porch and stood up to wave to Brian and Ruth as they were parking. A big, goofy black lab was lumbering out to meet them as Ruth got out and closed the car door. Sydney was following behind him. This is Buck, she said when they were close enough she didn't need to yell. Buck was sniffing Brian's feet and knees and Ruth's bag. Ruth was rubbing his ears. Hi, Buck. Aren't you a friendly boy? Ruth was saying to the slobbery beast. He's very friendly. I hope you don't mind, Sydney said apologetically. Not at all. But how is he with cats? Brian laughed. Oh, we have 5 or 6 cats on the grounds. Sydney smiled and extended her hand to Ruth to shake. I'm Sydney. You must be Ruth. Ruth smiled and took her hand to shake. Yes, I'm Ruth. It's nice to meet you. The house is so cute. Yeah, things look almost like I remember, Brian said, looking back and forth over the front of the house and the trees on either side and the horseshoe drive and the fence and the old one sign by the road. Hanging from the frame, the sign said, The Old Strodman Inn, and under it said, No longer in service. There were overgrown rose bushes and some olive trees that looked like giant hedges along an old wooden H-post fence. Some things have changed, but yeah, the house and stuff are pretty much the same. Shortly after Dad got sick, we had the pool redone. The construction was already planned and the first 2 payments made when he got his diagnosis, so we just went on with it. I'm glad we did. He got some real joy out of the pool until about 5 months ago. That's when things started getting really bad. Sydney paused and smiled at Brian and Ruth, who were politely listening to everything she said. Buck was now laying in the shade, licking his foot. Anyway, I can't wait for you to see everything. Come on, let's go in. Sydney turned toward the house now, and Buck got up and followed without being called. The place was really interesting and unique. The floor plan was pretty much a big letter T. When you entered, you were in a foyer sitting area that opened into a big kitchen. There was a dining table with 5 chairs on either side of the kitchen area and built-in china cupboards filled with china and stemware. Behind the kitchen was a door to the backyard, as well as a door with a lock on a wall that looked like someone's front door. It was the door to the ADA Master Suite apartment. Sydney was explaining the door lock was added when the house was turned into the inn so Grandma and Grandpa could have some privacy. She unlocked the door, and Ruth and Brian followed her into the apartment. So this is where your mom would live, Sydney gestured around with her arm. The living room area was wide and spacious, and there was a railing along all the walls. Dad started having trouble walking a couple years ago, but didn't want a chair right away, so he had these railings installed. We could take them out if your mom doesn't like them, Sydney said to Brian, who was starting to look around. I think she'll probably like them a lot. They'd be helpful, especially at first they'll be helpful especially at first, when she's still counting steps from room to room, he said to Sydney over his shoulder, while opening a door into the bedroom. That's right, your mom's totally blind now. Yeah, she doesn't let anyone forget it either, Brian chuckled, walking over to the kitchen and dining area. It was a small eat-in kitchen with a 2-burner stovetop and a toaster oven, but no proper oven. It was more of a kitchenette. That's all she needed anyway. And there was the other big kitchen. And there was the other big kitchen besides. Ruth just stood in the middle of the living room looking around and out the windows at the big backyard and swimming pool. It was beautiful, like a dream. She couldn't imagine Patty saying no. Can I take a couple photos for my mom? Brian asked. Take as many as you like. My dad isn't lucid today or yesterday, but sometimes he wakes up and says things in an urgent way before he passes back out. Last week he shot straight up in the bed and scared the nurse, screaming, Patty should have the house, damn it. Call Patty. The nurse called me, asking who Patty was. I came in and Dad was awake enough to tell me himself he wanted you and your mom to live here. He never said anything else, but I got the impression he felt badly about something," Sydney said. Brian nodded. "Yeah, I don't know what the story is, but my mom has always called your dad sneaky my whole life. My dad always shook his head and walked away from her when she did that," Brian said as he took some photos of the kitchen and the bed and bathroom. "How are you going to show those to your mom?" Ruth asked. Sydney nodded. "Yeah, how's Aunt Patty going to see those?" Brian smiled. "She's not, but Janie will." Ruth laughed. "That'll be enough. As soon as she hears Janie swoon, she'll start packing her bags." "Exactly," Brian said smugly to Ruth. "Janie is our downstairs neighbor," Brian explained to Sydney. "Oh, I get it. Well, make sure you get a photo of the laundry stack in the bathroom and the big shower. You can get a wheelchair in that shower with no problem. And there's a ramp out here." Sydney pointed through a sliding glass door towards the pool area in the backyard. "Dad had this put in last summer when he finally gave in and got the chair. The ramp goes right into the pool. You can even take the chair in the pool." "Mom's not in a chair and probably won't be for some time, but she does appreciate whenever there's a ramp anywhere. Steps are hard and have been getting harder. She can go anywhere except the upper floors on this property without having to use any stairs. Dad even had a ramp put in by the tennis courts so he could watch me and my boyfriend play." Sydney turned toward the front door of the apartment back into the main house. "Shall we look at the rest of the house?" She smiled at Ruth, who was dumbstruck. "Yes, please," Ruth said enthusiastically. Brian was all smiles as they walked back through the main kitchen. Anyone can use the kitchen, but since the inn closed, it rarely gets used. Every floor has its own kitchen, similar to the one in the apartment, but with full-sized appliances and dining area just on one side. You'll see when we get up there. Sydney turned to the right towards the doors. She opened one and flipped a light switch and entered. Brian and Ruth followed. The sides of the house are a mirror image of each other. There's a bedroom, bathroom suite on either side next to a staircase. There is a door at the bottom of each staircase, but other than the doors on the hinges down here, we had the stairwell doors removed when the inn closed. Dad thought family would come and visit and didn't want the house to be all closed up feeling or something. I don't know why, but we can put them back up for privacy. They're just out in the garage." Ruth looked around the bedroom bath suite. It had a big clawfoot tub with shower head and lots of closet space. The floors were hardwood and the walls were covered with an ivory on white embossed wallpaper. The windows were covered with cotton gauze curtains. The furnishings were sparse. Everything was very tasteful. Things weren't new. Many of the furnishings were real antiques, but everything was well taken care of. "Are all the bathrooms the same?" Ruth asked. Sydney and Brian were standing in the middle of the bedroom. Sydney turned to Ruth. "Oh, you mean the clawfoot tub?" "Yes, every floor is a clawfoot tub." Ruth smiled at Brian, who looked like he was on cloud nine. He hadn't said anything rude or snarky since they got out of the car, and Sydney seemed like a regular person. She was attractive, but natural. She didn't have any plastic surgery that Ruth could discern. She wasn't toothpick skinny. She looked like she enjoyed good food and exercise without being obsessed with either. Her hair was long and natural and pulled into a ponytail. Her clothes weren't anything pretentious, and her jewelry was simple. Ruth liked her. Sydney took them to each floor, explaining that the first floor was used as shared space for being together or entertaining larger groups or as guest rooms. She lived on the top floor, and the second and third floor would be for Brian and Ruth. She said the second and third floor were exactly the same, except that there was a kiddie door onto a catwalk that ended on the roof of the gazebo next to the pool on the second floor. Brian said he would probably want that floor. Ruth didn't care either way. Every floor was similarly furnished, but Sydney said things could easily be stored in a shed on the grounds to accommodate their own things. Ruth looked around at everything and thought she would be happy to use the furnishings that were there already. The bed was nicer than hers, and besides, her grandma's rocking chair and the lamp on her nightstand, nothing she owned held much meaning. She could make the last payment on her furniture and turn around and sell it and have a little extra cash to start off with. She could sell almost everything she owned. This was looking really good, but she was being careful not to seem too eager. For some reason, a poker face seemed to be important to maintain. "See, every floor is basically exactly the same." The three were standing in the dining area of the second floor, looking into the kitchen. It wasn't much different from the kitchen in Ruth's townhouse. The only thing it didn't have was a big pantry, but that was fine. If they were all living together, she imagined there would be a lot of shared meals in the main kitchen. Sydney now walked to the other side of the house towards the bedroom on the opposite side as the one they looked at downstairs. She opened the door into the bathroom. The bathrooms on this side of the house only have a shower because this is where the laundry stack is located on each floor. It was better than anything Ruth had at her townhouse. Her laundry stack was only half size and twice as old. These were full size and new, maybe only a couple years old. Brian and Sydney were reminiscing about things from childhood while Ruth opened doors and cupboards. Next floor? Sydney asked as they came to the stairwell on the other side of the house. See what I mean? The door goes here. We can put them back on easily. Ruth just smiled and nodded. Brian led the way to the third floor, Ruth's floor. Ruth walked into the middle of the space and looked out the window over the roof of the ADA apartment and the backyard from the dining area. She could definitely see herself drinking her coffee here in the mornings. Sydney was right. Every floor was the same. You want to see my floor? Sydney asked meekly. Buck was already up there, evidently. He had followed them when they came in the house, then disappeared. Sure, we'd love to, Brian said. Great. Then we can go out and see the pool and the tennis court, and I can show you the garden project I want to start. Sydney began to climb the last stairs to the top floor, her floor. When they got to the top of the stairs, the top floor smelled different than the others. It smelled like perfume and fabric softener and coffee and toast. It smelled lived in, unlike the other floors, which just smelled like bleach and Murphy's oil soap. Buck was sleeping on a big overstuffed cushion next to a pink tufted sofa. Ruth now saw what Brian had meant about Sydney being a Barbie princess. Everything was some shade of pink. Sydney looked around and laughed. Did Brian warn you? She asked. Brian blushed. I told her you were a Barbie princess. I didn't tell her what I meant. Ruth was laughing. I love it, Sydney. It's not how I decorate my space, but I love it. It looks great and it suits you. What does Buck think? At the sound of his name, Buck lumbered over and plopped down at Sydney's feet. Buck doesn't care. Dogs are colorblind anyway. Sydney rubbed Buck's ears. You ready to see the grounds now? Sydney took them around the pool and gazebo with barbecue pit and over the tennis court. The grounds were overgrown and the fences needed repaired here and there, but things were in decent shape as far as Ruth and Brian could tell. Brian's Uncle Melvin did all the groundswork himself until he couldn't anymore. Then he hired people he knew could do the work after that. The past 2 years had been hard because Melvin had been so sick. A lot of things had fallen behind. When Sydney led them to the garden area, Ruth saw what she could be doing for the next couple of years. Ruth was whipped back to her grandma's yard and garden. There were raised beds and beds in the ground. There were overgrown herbs and some fruit trees covered in old fruit and surrounded with weeds. I'd like to start growing as much of the food we eat as possible, she told Ruth. Ruth was sold, but she'd wait at least until they were in the car before she said anything to Brian. I like gardening, is all Ruth said to Sydney. Well, I've seen enough, Brian said. I promised my mom I would bring home food for her, and we should probably get going so we don't hit too much traffic on the way back, Brian said as they stood in the back corner of the garden under an apple tree. Okay, just call me later tonight or tomorrow and let me know what you think. You know what? Just call me tomorrow. Talk to your mom and everyone else, and everyone sleep on it tonight, Sydney said and headed with Buck at her side back toward the front of the house and the driveway. Brian and Ruth followed at a little distance behind them. It was a bit of a walk. So what do you think? Brian whispered to Ruth as they walked back. Ruth's eyes got wide for a moment. It's a lot of room, Brian. A lot of room and a lot of possibility. In a place like this, we could run our own business, Ruth said, looking down at the ground as she walked. Our own business? Doing what? Brian sounded interested. I don't know, but we could do something between the three of us. Come on. But Sydney's right. We should sleep on it. Ooh, Ruth and Brian, Brian and Ruth. Ruth and Brian, Brian and Ruth. What is going to happen next? I don't know. I guess you're going to have to wait and see.